A ruined village, pitted and scarred by its wartime past.
You see a war zone kind of frozen in amber.
A ghostly fleet of ships, lost in the wilderness, doomed to destruction.
There's something really quite spooky about it.
A bridge to nowhere, hidden in the forest that came to a grisly end.
It has this otherworldly quality to it, and it doesn't really feel like it should be, in our world.
And strange metal structures concealed in dense woodland.
It's deep in the Maine wilderness, far from anything. What is it, and what is it doing here?
Once they were some of the most advanced structures and facilities on the planet, at the cutting edge of design and construction. Today, they stand abandoned, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. But who built them and how? And why were they abandoned? On the arid plains of northern Spain, 265 kilometers from its capital, Madrid, lies a ghost town. Although the town has a strange beauty, the ruins of hollowed-out buildings are everywhere, and rubble is piled up in the empty streets.
The story goes that if you listen hard enough, you can hear voices from the past.
You see the ruins of a city that clearly suffered some kind of disaster. Was it an earthquake? Was it some kind of rushed evacuation? What knocked down these buildings, and why were they never rebuilt?
Its name is Belchite. To add to the strangeness, there's another town with the same name right next to it. Why are there two Belchites side by side? And what happened to cause such devastation to one of them?
And then you look closer and you see something odd about some of these ruins. They're not just eroded by weather and gravity. They're chipped away. You can look closer and you can see bullet holes, damage from mortar fire. This is a unique form of erosion. This is the erosion of war.
Which army was responsible for destroying the town? And why was it never rebuilt? For the reasons, we need to look to the bloody civil war that ripped Spain apart in the last century. In 1936, Spain was a deeply divided country that was politically torn between the extreme right and left. The nationalist fascists and the anti-fascist Republicans. Leading the nationalist side was General Francisco Franco, a man who would eventually rule Spain with an iron fist until his death in 1975. Franco was supported by other fascist countries, notably Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Nazi Germany. The Republicans drew their support from the Soviet Union and from the famous International Brigades, the paramilitary units who fought in support of the Popular Front government of the Second Spanish Republic during the Civil War.
The Spanish Civil War started as a conflict within Spain itself. You had a very left-wing government and then right-wing forces in the military basically staged a coup against their own elected government.
By the following year, these right-wing nationalist forces under General Franco were controlling a large part of Spain.
In an attempt to slow down their advance, in August 1937, Republican forces decided to attack Zaragoza. The city was the regional capital, and a communications center for the important Aragon front.
Isn't so strategically important, but it was an important enough city that it would have been a real blow to nationalist morale.
En route to Zaragoza was Belchite. The original Republican plan was to bypass the village, but that wasn't what happened. Instead, its forces attacked.
So here you have Belchite with a few thousand, not elite, Spanish nationalist troops, but they're supplied well enough, armed well enough, that they turn the town into a small fortress. Instead of going straight for Zaragoza, which they could have taken, they get bogged down in this village of 3,800 people.
Who were the men who fought to take Belchite? And what was their connection to a fighting unit from the United States?
When the world learned that Franco and his fascist compatriots were trying to overthrow the elected government of Spain, there was really a lot of outrage, and a lot of people wanted to come and help this beleaguered government. And so a lot of people from the West came to volunteer and assist.
Around 3,000 of those volunteers were from the United States. They formed the Abraham Lincoln Battalion and made their way to Belchite.
By Belchite, the Abraham Lincoln Battalion has been through a couple of major campaigns. They are really veterans. They're first-rate troops at this time. They weren't when they started, but at this point, they have learned on the job, and they're pretty effective soldiers.
It was these motivated and battle-hardened soldiers that made the assault on Belchite. Juan Simon, a tour guide in the old town, explains how the Americans and their Republican allies attacked the town.
They attack with bombing, with artillery. They use tanks too, Russian tanks, the T-26, and mortars. They attack by all sides.
The civilians, who were unable to escape, hid in their cellars as the battle raged above them.
The town was essentially under siege. They were cut off from the outside, food, water. It was really quite a brutal way to take a city without much concern for the lives or the welfare of the civilians who were trapped inside.
But the nationalist forces had a strategic advantage. From the top of this tower, which is still disfigured by the shell fire, they had a clear line of fire down on to the Republican troops below.
It was very important to take this charge because there were a machine gun there at the tower that had views of all the surroundings. From this side of the charge, we can see now the shell that is embedded in the first section of the tower.
Once the Republican troops had taken out the machine gun, the Lincoln Battalion was able to force its way in through the church of St. Augustine.
You can see the breach that made the artillery to allow the Republican troops of the Lincoln Battalion to enter the town by this place. The old town of Belchite had very narrow and winding streets. It was impossible to enter the town any kind of tank or vehicle because the rabble was in the streets because of the bombing. Taking over Belchite was street by street.
These are really the worst kinds of battles. It's up close and it's personal. The noise, the explosions, you're going building to building, and that means throwing hand grenades, that means demolishing things. That means setting fire to buildings, to actually literally burn your enemy out. It's a high casualty form of warfare.
After 2 weeks of brutal and savage fighting, the Americans and their allies finally took control of the town.
It was very bloody, very devastating to the local population. When Ernest Hemingway, who was covering the Spanish Civil War for American newspapers, when he arrived in Belchite, he said the city was less a town than a bad smell.
Decomposing in the blistering summer sun, bodies from both sides piled up in the streets. In total, 3,000 people were killed. Were the gains worth the awful bloodshed?
Abraham Lincoln Battalion talked of this as one of the toughest fights in the war. And they aren't sure why their elite brigade was diverted to a house-to-house battle. But somehow it happened. It was really one of the big screw-ups of the war is the offensive that gained a little territory and literally accomplished no strategic effect at all.
6 months later, the tables were turned when nationalist forces retook Belchite. But why was the town never rebuilt?
Franco didn't want Belchite to be restored because he knew it had propaganda value. This was one of the great battles that the nationalists lost. You would think that you would want to celebrate your victories, but no. If you're a dictator and you can point to a horrific disaster where many civilians lost their lives, then you can stand up and say, if it weren't for me, this would keep happening. Franco wouldn't let the local population rebuild the city, but eventually they decided they just needed to build a new town next door.
Today, the town stands as a memorial to the thousands who lost their lives here, and as a stark reminder of the tragedy and brutality of the Civil War.
When you see Belchite today, you see a war zone kind of frozen in amber. You see the effects, you see the bullet holes, you see where the mortar shells fell, and you see the tragedy of war and how so often wars aren't just fought between armies, they're often fought between armies with civilians caught in the middle. And that's what happened here. That's what makes it so heartbreaking.
On the western coast of Canada, in Powell River, a small town 170 kilometers from Vancouver, is an astonishing sight. Ships stretch across the water, one connected to the other, listing gently towards the shore.
It looks like a decaying ghost fleet with their crews mysteriously missing. There's something really quite spooky about it.
They're covered in barnacles and moss and seaweed. It's almost as if nature is claiming them back again.
Heavy, rusting chains extend across their decks. Their crews have long since gone. What secrets do the ships hold?
People think there's still treasure somewhere deep inside, and if they can just get in there and see what's there, maybe they'll find something really interesting.
It's hard to tell how old the ships are or where they're from. But there's one thing they all have in common.
The really unusual thing about these boats is that, unlike most, they're not made of steel. These ones are made of concrete.
They've definitely inspired a sense of mystery growing up. You start to wonder, like, what are these things? Where did they come from? What is their story?
How are they connected to one of the deadliest weapons ever made? The answers are rooted in the desperate days at the end of the First World War. There had already been 3 years of trench warfare on the Western Front, which had resulted in a bloody stalemate. The Allied big push on the Somme in 1916, which was supposed to break the deadlock, had lasted 4 months and gained practically nothing. The Allied cause received a boost in April 1917, when the United States declared war on Germany. Within 15 months, there were 1 million US troops in France. Although these vast numbers were committed to the land war, the US also urgently needed to expand its naval fleet, but it was running out of raw materials. It had to find a solution to the problem.
They come up with the idea, let's try concrete. Well, problem with most concretes is they're too heavy. Now they had to develop, and they succeeded in developing a new type of concrete that was light, but still very, very strong.
During World War I, they were a go-to option because they didn't take up the important raw materials like steel that were needed for the war effort, and they could be made cheaply and much more functionally out of concrete. And concrete, of course, does float.
The ships so impressed the US government that they ordered 24 of them.
And they're completed just as the war ends. But they're put into service, and they actually work pretty well. Once you've made a concrete ship, it is actually quite a long-lasting thing. Concrete, unlike steel, doesn't get metal fatigue, doesn't wear out, it doesn't rust. So potentially you have a very easy to maintain kind of ship.
In fact, the ships were so effective that when there was a shortage of steel during the Second World War, naval architects once again turned to concrete.
All of them had a very similar purpose, which was mainly to act as freight ships and for storage, because they're very good at holding large amounts of material and keeping it dry.
But what are 10 cargo ships from 2 world wars doing here in British Columbia? This is the ghostly fleet that the locals call the Hulks. Around the beginning of the last century, paper mills sprung up all along the coast, including here at Powell River.
The logs used to make the paper were transported to the mill by water and then unloaded into a log pond. It had to be big enough to store the logs and be protected from the elements to keep it safe for the workers. The only problem here is it's exposed to severe winds from both the north and the south, and they needed to find a way to shelter the log pond.
So the mill owners decided to build a breakwater, a barrier built into the sea to protect the log pond from the force of the waves, as mechanical engineer Matthew Denniston explains.
So typically a breakwater structure would be made of large rocks dumped in big piles, and it would build up from the sea floor to make that protection, where in our case, it's far too deep to make this type of breakwater. So I think the light bulb just came on, hey, why not use ships instead? Steel, being in salt water in the ocean, deteriorates very quickly if it's not protected. And we found that we would have a steel ship that would come in and it would maybe last 20 years before it had to be decommissioned, where these concrete ships were already 40 years old, coming in to replace them, and have still lasted another 50 plus years.
In 1948, the first concrete ships arrived in Powell River. But how effective would they be as a breakwater?
The ships were anchored down and chained together to form a sort of artificial reef. To help them withstand the elements, they were weighed down with gravel and they list to one side, so their decks are angled towards the shore.
They're actually much heavier than ordinary ships, so much more effective in keeping the water and the weather at bay.
One of the ships is the Quartz, and it has a hidden past.
So one of the most unique things about this ship is that it was actually a part of some of the first nuclear testing that the US military did on Bikini Atoll. And this ship specifically was part of the nuclear test Baker.
The test bomb propelled a dome of water 1.5 kilometers wide into the sky. It created a wall of radioactive mist that contaminated many of the surrounding ships, including the Quartz.
They were simply there to see the effect of the nuclear blast on ships. So, you know, they had ships of every type and description at Bikini Atoll, and they wanted to get radioactivity readings. They also wanted to see the blast effect that different nuclear weapons would have at different ranges.
10 years later, and radiation-free, the Quartz arrived at Powell River to join the other concrete ships.
The service life was supposed to only be 15 years, when in reality, here we are, 75 years later, and they're still holding strong.
So why are there now plans to sink some of them? Today, the paper mill no longer needs such a large log pond.
The plans now are to sink some or most of the ships and allow them to become a natural reef, bringing to life again the underwater maritime colony and community. The ships are an extraordinary story of creation and technology. They were born out of desperation, out of a need to find a way to build ships with new materials. And yet when that need was gone, they found another use here, acting as a breakwater, and when even that role is completing, they're now going to find another one down on the seabed as reefs. They really are a testimony to the creativity and creation of what can be done with new materials.
Hidden deep within woodland in southeast Germany, 600 kilometers from its capital, Berlin, is a strange sight. A cold and bleak landscape, disfigured by charred rock.
There's a real air of foreboding. You can tell that something bad happened.
It looks entirely natural until you see metal spikes puncturing the stone.
You're walking along, and suddenly the floor turns to concrete, and then you see an embedded footprint there, and you keep walking, and then further along there's another footprint.
And immediately you think, just what went on here? Who made these footprints? And what happened to them?
The mystery deepens the further you go. Rusted, corroded steel and badly weathered concrete is twisted violently out of any recognizable shape.
Whatever happened here would take one heck of a force to cause this much damage.
And there's more. Concealed beneath the forest floor is a mysterious tunnel. Nearby, just visible through the trees, are strange depressions. And what's most sinister is an arch. A bridge to nowhere. How are they all connected?
You've got what looks like a giant rib of some massive dinosaur sticking out of the earth.
There is something really fantastical about it. It has this otherworldly quality to it, and it doesn't really feel like it should be, in our world.
Who constructed this arch? And why did its builders die in their thousands? And what cataclysmic event caused its destruction? In the final years of the Second World War, the Allied bombing campaign against Germany reached its peak.
The Germans have lost control not only of the airspace over France and the Allied landing areas, but they've lost control of the airspace over their own country.
Despite the millions of tons of bombs dropped on German cities such as Hamburg and Cologne, there had not been a complete collapse in civilian morale, which had been part of the aim. Nor had Germany's industrial capacity and production been severely reduced. That changed towards the end of the war, when targeted attacks on German infrastructure and her industrial heartlands began to take effect. Allied bombs were destroying German factories, severely affecting her ability to continue fighting.
So the Germans have to find some way to defend themselves against the Allied onslaught.
So German High Command decided to move production of certain armaments into caves.
The problem the Germans have is that it's really, really hard to make caves in rock. Their clever solution is they're going to make giant artificial caverns where there was no cave before.
And this is the result: Weingut I, a vast concrete structure that the Germans hoped would allow them to keep their war machine running. But what were they going to build here? And why was it hidden deep within a forest in southeast Germany? Local historian Dr. Erhard Bosch explained that the site had to match a very specific set of requirements.
In order to be able to build concrete buildings, you need gravel, you need water, you need cement, and you need steel. And all that was here.
It was Weingut's sheer size that sucked in resources.
This bunker presented all sorts of engineering challenges. It would consist of 12 separate arches and be 1/4 mile long. Each arch would be over 100 feet wide. It's a major construction project.
A workforce of over 10,000 was gathered together, and construction of the first arch began in July 1944.
Building arches is a challenge. They're very strong shapes when they're actually finished, but while you're constructing them, you have to keep them supported in order to keep it stable.
Usually, a timber or steel frame was used, but dwindling resources meant that the builders had to use another material.
You need as much gravel as possible because the construction method you're going to use requires mountains of gravel.
They could pile up this gravel into an immense shape, this arched shape, and then create their concrete arch on top of that.
But how would these vast mounds of gravel be moved from one arch to another? A few hundred kilometers away, there's a clue.
This was an underground tunnel with mine carts on a rail track. Once each arch was completed, the gravel that was beneath it was dumped down through hatches into these waiting carts, which would then take the gravel along to the next construction site.
The pressure was on to finish the bunker, to begin production of a plane the Germans hoped would change the course of the war. It was the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me-262. Overhead was a roof that was virtually bomb-proof.
We are here under the 7th archway. The foundations to the left and right go 17 meters deep. In the lean concrete layer, you can see it up here. It has broken away in some places. The first reinforcing rods can be seen. They reinforce 5 meters of concrete.
When complete, the factory would have seen production on a massive scale.
They wanted to dig further down from here and would have had 8 factory floors. When you consider the overall area that they would have had, the manufacturing area, that's an area of 114,000 square meters. That is approximately 14 football pitches.
Who built these enormous arches? And what is their connection to these deep caverns, hollowed out of the ground, just over 3 kilometers away?
These craters are all over this particular area. It's hard to tell exactly what happened here to create these holes just by looking at them, but their size and their depth are ominous.
What were these craters? And how were they linked to thousands of deaths deep in the German woodland? It was because slave laborers from the death camps were forced to build Weingut. Their huts once stood where the craters now are.
They had no heat, they had no toilet facilities, they had no washing facilities, they didn't even have fresh water.
They didn't have enough to eat, so you can imagine that they became emaciated very quickly. If they did try to escape, they were shot if they were caught.
4,000 of the Weingut slave laborers died here. By the end of April 1945, only 7 arches had been completed. But the Allies were already sweeping through Germany. The area was liberated and placed under American control the following month. So why is there now only 1 arch left standing? The clue is in the twisted steel and concrete.
If there were another world war, the Americans thought they might adopt a bunker like this for their own military installations back in the US. But first, they wanted to see just how strong it was. So they decided to blow it up.
The US blew the arches up one by one until they had discovered how much explosive power each structure could withstand.
So all of the Cold War era nuclear bunkers are based in their structure on tests that were done in 1947 here at Weingut I.
After it was destroyed, Weingut was abandoned.
When I look at the ruins of Weingut I, that terrible slave labor project that was designed to keep the Nazi war machine going, and I look at its failure, then I know that when power is untrammeled by justice, it can only go so far before it destroys itself.
In a remote forest in Maine, at the northeastern tip of the United States, is something you don't expect to stumble across.
You're in this part of Maine that is overgrown with trees and low forests, and it's very scenic. And then in the middle of it, you can see the remnants of old cables and machinery.
There are 2 identical structures made of metal, completely rusted out, with what appears to be a pipe coming out of the back of it.
You can see a large old engine. Clearly something technical and industrial used to dominate this space.
It looks like some mad experiment gone wrong. An eccentric scientist who decided to create something fantastical in the middle of nowhere.
But what is it? And how is it related to these 2 dilapidated locomotives?
You come across what looks like a pulley system. and these rusted and corroded pieces of metal, which looks like broken pieces of track.
The entire woodland is full of mystery. Normally, tracks connect something, but these just end abruptly. But are they somehow joined? And if so, how?
And then you have the fact that it's so remote. It's deep in the Maine wilderness, far from anything. So the question is, what is it? And what is it doing here?
To find out, we need to look to an industry that helped define Maine and make America great during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The logging industry.
Northern Maine has 18 million acres of forest land, and at the turn of the last century, it was the hub of the logging industry at the time when timber was king.
The USA was growing fast, and so was demand for wood. But it was not only domestic demands that were driving the industry. During the late 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing in countries such as Great Britain. It too had an insatiable appetite for lumber. In fact, it is estimated that at one point, Maine had the largest shipping port for lumber in the world. And so forests were being felled at breakneck speed by lumber barons eager to profit from these huge new markets. Matthew LaRoche, superintendent of the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, explains how it worked.
The loggers would come up the river systems, cutting pine, and as the pine got depleted, they would just keep moving up the rivers.
You know, cutting down the tree is the easy part. The hard part is getting that giant log out of wherever it fell and into some kind of transportation system that can get it to the sawmill or the paper mill.
The nearest sawmill was in Bangor, 145 miles away. The only problem was they needed to find a way to transport all these logs between one lake and another across a really narrow strip of land.
This isolated stretch of land lay between Eagle and Chamberlain lakes.
And it was only about 3,000 feet, just a little more than half a mile. But if you were going to drag all those logs by oxen, it might as well have been 50 miles.
How would they overcome the problem of hauling thousands of logs across this narrow strip of land? A way had to be found to bridge the gap. And this is what they came up with. An ingenious system of rails, cable, and iron, powered by the technology of the day. It was called Eagle Lake Tramway.
Essentially, the tramway was a small railway that was pulled by a cable loop and powered by steam.
But this narrow strip of land was in the middle of nowhere. How would they be able to transport the parts?
So all the material came by rail to Greenville, up Moosehead Lake with steamboats, and then landed at Northeast Cary, and from there it was brought in with horses on sleds in the middle of the wintertime. We're talking about a 35-mile trip with sleds and horses to get this material in here.
It took 12 arduous months to build the tramway. But would it actually work?
When they originally put this together, they had to bolt all of these dollies to the cable, and it turned out that they tightened the bolts down all the way, but it wasn't quite tight enough, so everything slipped and nothing worked. And they then had to take thousands of bolts back out, and it turned out the threads didn't go far enough down the bolt, so they had to get out a filing system and extend the threads a little bit, one at a time, and then put it all back together.
Once it was finished, The workers watched nervously as the trucks crawled along, and they noticed it wasn't going as fast as they had expected. That was because there's a bump along the path, and once the logs got over the bump, the weight of the logs helped it pick up steam the rest of the way.
Would the tramway system be able to move thousands of logs over land to mills in Bangor and beyond?
The tramway ran on these rails right here. There was a top layer and a bottom layer. And these trucks, and there's one right there, the logs went onto those little pointed things. The logs would be pulled on the Eagle Lake end, and they would travel this top layer of rails all the way to Chamberlain Lake, and then roll off the end of the tramway and dump into Chamberlain Lake, and from there it was log drive down to Bangor.
The logs moved at 5 kilometers an hour, powered entirely by steam.
These are the boilers, which created steam, ran through these pipes up here, over to this engine that would drive this belt, and the belt drove the machinery over here, these reduction gears, and the big final drive over there with the U-shaped cutouts in it was where the trucks fit into the cable fit right into there, and it would drove the logs over there and dropped them right into Chamberlain Lake over there. It was quite a engineering marvel for the time.
The tramway operated from 1903 to 1909, carrying in total 100 million board feet of timber. But why did the lumber barons abandon such an effective system after only 6 years?
Eventually, a small railroad was built that was able to move the logs in an even more convenient fashion. And in fact, this was the way that logging was being done across New England at that time. There were dozens of small little rail lines being built into all kinds of wilderness areas for the sole purpose of extracting the timber.
They did not remove the tramway from this location when they stopped using it, primarily because it was such a remote area. They couldn't really take it out. I suppose they didn't really know if they would use it again, but they never did. Once they shut it down, it never got used again.
Now the tramway is rusting away and gradually being reclaimed by nature.
When I come here and I see people looking at them and they asking a bunch of questions, how'd they get it here? What did it do? When did it work? How much did it move? It kind of renews your enthusiasm for the site.
When I see this kind of thing, it just makes me think about the enormous effort, the sweat, the ingenuity that went into these kinds of projects and into building the United States.
Now they lie abandoned, but once they were at the cutting edge of engineering. There are echoes from history in these decaying structures. They remind us of terror and war, but also of great innovation and human endeavor.